Trump's stunning U-turn on NATO, China, Russia, and Syria. Let's take a listen.
Wouldn't it be nice if we actually got along with people? Wouldn't it be nice if we actually got along, as an example, with Russia? I'm all for it. Right now, we're not getting along with Russia at all. We may be at an all-time low. NATO is obsolete. It's costing us too much money. It's too much, and frankly, it's a different world. I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete. We can't continue to allow China to rape our country. We had a very good bonding. I think we had a very good chemistry together. President Xi wants to do the right thing. So I've watched Assad, and I've watched a little bit on the other side. The problem is the other side of Assad, we have no idea who they are. They probably are ISIS. I'm saying, are we better off with Assad? We have no idea who these people are. What are we doing? Why are we involved? It shouldn't be allowed. That's a butcher. That's a butcher. So I felt we had to do something about it. And a circle. We will see it all. Biometrics.
Washington, CNN. Within a few hours of extraordinary political shape-shifting, President Donald Trump abandoned stances that were at the bedrock of his establishment-bashing campaign. NATO, he said, is no longer obsolete. He backed down a threat to brand China a currency manipulator. How Trump came to love NATO. In another reversal, Trump praised Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen, whom he had previously pledged to replace when her team expires, and once accused of holding interest rates low as a political boost for former President Barack Obama. It was not clear whether Trump's sudden policy flips were the product of a new outlook and worldview, but previous presidents have often remarked that the world looks a lot different from the Oval Office than from a campaign rally. But Trump's political gymnastics didn't stop there. Days after his administration had seemed to accept an ultra-realist approach that would allow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to remain in control of his shattered nation, Trump described him as a butcher, quote, over chemical weapons attacks on civilians, fueling speculation. He now advocates regime change. That position, sure to antagonize Russia, came as the president adopted the most skeptical view he has yet displayed on the possibility of improving relations with the Kremlin, a position he once advanced as a candidate and that flew in the face of geopolitical realities and universal elite opinion in Washington. Right now, we are not getting along with Russia at all. We may be at an all-time low in terms of relationship with Russia, quote, Trump said at a White House news conference, in stark tones at odds with his former vows to ease the new chill in ties with the U.S. nuclear foe. By contrast, Trump was full of praise of Xi Jinping, whom he met in Florida last week, saying that he believed the Chinese president was sincere in helping defuse the U.S. showdown with nuclear North Korea. Trump made castigating China a staple of his presidential campaign, saying the communist giant was guilty of, quote, rape against the U.S. economy, and promising it would be branded a currency manipulator on his first day in Oval Office. It was almost as if Trump's outsider presidential campaign never happened, as he rushed to embrace mainstream political and national security positions he once publicly abhorred. Circumstances change, quote, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer told CNN Jim Acosta Wednesday when asked about the apparent reversals. On China, Spicer cautioned the administration's report is not complete on whether to label China as a currency manipulator, but he said the Chinese have made some improvements on currency in recent months. The administration has to make its assessment on where China stands now. not where it is, not where it was during the campaign, Spicer said. On NATO, Spicer pointed out to the Secretary General's interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer on, quote, the Situation Room, where he indicated that NATO countries have been performing better in terms of their financial commitments that changed Trump's view of the group, Spicer said. It may not be a coincidence that Trump's adoption of conventional political positions came the day after a stunning interview with the New York Post in which he publicly criticized his political guru, Stephen Bannon, his insurgent, populist political conscience. Trump diminishes but does not dismiss Bannon. Bannon was dumped from the National Security Council last week in a move that was seen as a triumph for officials who represent a more traditional globalist foreign policy worldview. His demotion was seen as another sign that the more moderate, establishment-oriented influences in his administration, epitomized by his son-in-law Jared Kushner, Trump's daughter Ivanka, and chief economic advisor Gary Cohn, were rising to the detriment of Bannon and his anti-establishment cohort, Stephen Miller. Of course, one day of policy adjustments does not necessarily mean that Trump's unique political persona and methodology are suddenly going to change. After all, the president has spent most of his first 100 days in office torching conventional political practice, trading in untruths and exaggerations, and pouring oil on political controversies on Twitter, including accusations that his campaign had links to the Kremlin at the time when Moscow was being accused of interfering in the U.S. election. There is no sign, for instance, that Trump is pulling back from other controversial positions, including doubling down on border enforcement and expulsion of undocumented immigrants. Still, the new tones on Russia, NATO, Yellen, and Bannon amounted to too much of a sample of modified political behavior to represent a mere coincidence. Yes, this is strange to me also. Trump, NATO no longer obsolete? Perhaps the most striking 180-degree reversal by Trump on Wednesday came on NATO. While he was a candidate, Trump sent shockwaves through Europe by declaring that the most successful military alliance in history was, quote, obsolete. Side by side with NATO, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on Wednesday at an East Room news conference, Trump took the opposite tack. Quote, the Secretary General and I had a productive discussion about what more NATO can do in the fight against terrorism, Trump said. I complained about that a long time ago, and they made a change, and now they do fight terrorism. I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete. Trump's claim that NATO has suddenly adopted an anti-terrorism mandate because of his efforts is highly debatable. The Western Alliance spent years fighting in Afghanistan in a war that was first launched to rout out al-Qaeda and its Taliban protectors after the September 11th attacks in 2001. But Trump's commitment allowed the president a graceful way of walking back a position that had once threatened to undermine the very rationale of transatlantic defense relations. Stoltenberg offered a subtle reminder that NATO nations are hardly novices when it comes to fighting terrorism. He noted that the only time NATO invoked its Common Defense Clause, Article 5, was after 9/11. And he spoke about the sacrifices of more than 1,000 European and Canadian soldiers killed in the Afghanistan war. Still, Trump's comments on Wednesday, paving the way for his visit to NATO headquarters in Brussels in May, will likely send a sigh of relief through Europe. take a listen here. Must we watch commercials?
The QX60 comes with an easily accessible third-row seat, but that's not the seat you bought it for. Built for families, designed for drivers. Infiniti, empowered to drive.
The relationship between the US and Russia, of course, taking a rather dramatic turn since Donald Trump took office. Now, those heightened tensions over Syria. Could a new Cold War be brewing between the two countries? Let's talk about all of this with Barry Pavel, who is a Senior Vice President and Director at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. Joining us now from Washington. Good to see you. What was your read on what was said today, but also how it was said, the dynamic?
I had very low expectations for the Moscow meetings, and I think the Trump administration, if I'm reading things correctly, achieved their goal. They wanted to deliver a message in a new tone that now they're going to have a little more leverage in places like Syria, and Russia's going to have to react. I think we have sort of a Nixon goes to China, hopefully, type of phenomenon happening where the Russians only respect strength. The Russians did not expect the Obama administration to ever use military force and thereby to get any leverage in Syria in terms of resolving the crisis. And I think we've seen over history, including the Cold War, when the Russians are dealing with an administration that has resolved to back up its commitments and to leverage diplomacy, then I think you can get things done. So this is the beginning of a new journey and a new direction for U.S.-Russia relations.
Yeah, the Russians, we've already heard them saying, do not attack the regime again. But, what if chemical weapons are used again and the U.S. does respond? What are the lines in the sand? What are the risks for the U.S. if they keep saying, you do this, we'll do that, all of a sudden you're in the war?
Well, I think the only purpose of the missile strikes was to deter future chemical weapons use by Assad. I think even if he doesn't use chemical weapons, you're not going to materially change the course of the war. You're not going to really ease humanitarian suffering because of all the other bombs and ways of attacking civilians that Syrian forces use. But I think my big principle here is the Russians run risks as well. And I think if the U.S. needs to and wants to gain more leverage, we have just as much a right to declare certain zones off limits to Russia, to deconflict with them as they do. They have risks that we need to make sure that we sort of leverage as well.
Exactly. Well, everybody says negotiated settlement. It's the only answer. It's the only way to peace. But what chance that happening? You've got so many stark differences between the major players, the Russians, the Iranians, the Americans, the West in general, not to mention a vast group of opposition factions on the ground who have their own agendas. What do you think the chances are?
I think the chances in April are very low, but I think this is the beginning of a new dynamic, and I think this is really the first time since the Syria war began that Assad and Putin have had any sort of negative sanctions around them, any sort of influence that wasn't just carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. So now that this potential challenge to them is there on the table, I think it might stimulate different dynamics in terms of the political process, the Geneva process, but it's going to take a long time. Let's not be naive about this.
And just quickly, of course, the biggest question of all is who's the alternative? Who's the candidate to replace Assad, his family, somebody that the Russians will accept, as we said, the Iranians, the international community, for that matter, the Syrian people?
Well, that's a big question, and the table has to be very inclusive, but I can't imagine that there's not someone who would still help meet Russia's needs in terms of maintaining their relationship, but who wouldn't have so much blood on their hands like Assad or anybody in Assad's family, 500,000 of his own people killed brutally, hospitals bombed, refugees forced out of the country to flood into Europe. I think there's got to be a couple of candidates here and there that a negotiated process could help unearth.
Barry Pavel at the Atlantic Council, great to get your expertise. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
The president's modified rhetoric on Russia is also likely to reassure the American allies that had been deeply disturbed by his apparent desire to pursue a rapprochement with Moscow. perhaps at the expense of Western allies. I'll also see about Putin over a period of time. It would be a fantastic thing if we got along with Putin and if we got along with Russia, and that could happen, and it may not happen. It may be just the opposite, Trump said. Trump's comments came with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in Moscow for frosty talks with Putin and could reflect a new perspective on the Russian leader from Trump as he contemplates the Kremlin's support for Assad and the horrific aftermath of chemical weapons attacks on civilians that prompted the president to launch cruise missile attacks last week. Quote, everybody in this room saw it all too many times over the last 3 or 4 days. Young children dying, babies dying, fathers holding children in their arms that were dead. Trump said, dead children. There can't be a worse sight, and it shouldn't be allowed. That's a butcher. That's a butcher. Again, I don't believe that Assad did this, but let's take a listen. Again, a commercial. Sorry, guys.
The QX60 comes with an easily accessible third-row seat, but that's not the seat you bought it for. Built for families, designed for drivers. Infinity, empowered to drive.
It was very disappointing to see. It's disappointing no matter who does it, but when you get into the gases, especially that form, it's vicious and violent, and everybody in this room saw it all too many times over the last 3 or 4 days. Young children dying, babies dying, fathers holding children in their arms that were dead children. There can't be a worse sight, and it shouldn't be allowed. That's a butcher. That's a butcher. So I felt we had to do something about it. I have absolutely no doubt we did the right thing. And it was very, very successfully done, as you well know. Thank you.
On China, if Trump was downbeat on Putin, he was surprisingly gushing about Xi following their summit at his Mar-a-Lago resort last week. I don't know Putin, but I do know this gentleman. I've spent a lot of time with him over the last 2 days, and he is the president of China. Trump said during the news conference, President Xi wants to do the right thing. We had a very good bonding. I think we had a very good chemistry together. I think he wants to help us with North Korea. We talked trade. We talked a lot of things, he added. And I said, the way you're going to make a good trade deal is to help us with North Korea. Otherwise, we're just going to go it alone. While there is no guarantee that China sees its interests as aligned with those of the United States over North Korea question or elsewhere in Asia, Trump's position did represent a complete overhaul of rhetorical tone towards Beijing. Soon after his election, he warned Chinese leaders in a tweet that he might use the issue of U.S. relations with Taiwan and adherence to the, quote, one China policy on the table as a bargaining chip. Had he pursued that plan, he could have put policies that underpinned 40 years of Sino-U.S. relations at risk. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, the president also gave notice that he would not penalize Beijing as a currency manipulator as he had promised to do during the campaign. They're not currency manipulators, Trump said. The president repeatedly took the opposite stance during his campaign, even though experts say China has not been artificially suppressing the value of the yuan for years and has actually been doing the exact opposite. The president also gave a hint of flexibility on his demands for China to reverse the trade imbalance with the United States, another bedrock of his campaign. He suggested that if China helped to defuse the threat to the U.S. from its ally North Korea, he might settle for a less advantageous trade deal. Trump and the Fed rewriting the script with Yellen. Trump also offered an olive branch to Yellen in the Wall Street Journal interview. I like her, I respect her, Trump said, and referring to his prediction that he would not renominate her when her term ends in 2018, he said it's very early. In yet another ditching of a campaign position, Trump expressed support for the U.S. Export-Import Bank, a beta noir of some of the anti-Washington voters that helped him reach the White House, which has been left in limbo with 2 open seats on its board. Quote, actually, it's a very good thing and it actually makes money. It could make a lot of money, Trump told the Journal. Well, this is very confusing as to why he did a 180 on all of this. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and thank you for watching.